There are several elements involved in making cane syrup, but the most important one is time. It just takes time. It's an all-day process to boil 120 gallons of cane juice down to about 15 or so gallons of syrup. It's a lot of water to have to boil away. And you have to get the cane first, and that takes time. Time to go to the cane field and strip and cut the cane. It takes some helpers who have the time to put in to help you, too. Leo Beatty of the Lewin community in Jasper County has as his help friend and neighbor Larry Smith of Lewin and syrup maker Tobby Taylor of Morton and Tobby's father, Buddy Taylor. Leo uses a century-old tool to strip the cane while it's still standing in the field. They don't make these cane strippers anymore, but they're pretty indispensable to anyone cutting sugar cane. Strip it while it stands, then cut out the top and stack it on the wagon. And then do that same thing over and over again several thousand times before the season is over, before you've harvested all the sugar cane in the patch. There's nothing in the sugar-making process that is new. Raising cane, cutting it, then crushing it to get out all the sweet sap in the middle. Now, there are improved ways of doing that, but nothing new. Now, for instance, the cane mill that Leo uses to crush the cane once belonged to his grandfather and was powered by a mule. A long pole on the top of the mill was hooked to the mule, and the mule would walk in continuous circles all day long as someone fed the cane into the crusher. All day long. And the juice would be collected and conveyed to the cooker. And Leo has modernized his mill to run off an electric motor, and another electric motor runs a conveyor belt that catches the crushed cane and carries it away from the mill where it piles up. Leo walked by this mill all of his life, and his daddy used to tell him stories of how his granddaddy made syrup with the cane mill back in the old days. And those stories stuck with Leo, and what you see here today at his syrup-making complex out behind his house near Lewin is a product of those stories.
If it hadn't been for Daddy's stories about them making syrup, the cane mill would probably still be sitting right where it's been since the early 1900s.
It takes a while to squeeze out the 120 gallons that Leo needs for one cooking to fill his syrup kettle. Now, making syrup in a kettle is new to some people, but this is the really old way that people used to make syrup before the days of the long, narrow evaporator pan.
The kettle originally started out as a wash pot. Then they found out that whenever they made syrup and it boiled up, it boiled out of the wash pot. So they put a lip on it, and then they started calling it a sugar kettle. Some people refer to it as just kettle cooking, but it's come a long way. It predates the evaporator pan by decades.
Even as the raw juice is filling the cooker, people show up out of nowhere to watch, or to take home a jug of juice if there's any left after the kettle is full. Anytime someone's making syrup, it draws a crowd.
And of course, word will spread from various sources that I'm cooking syrup. And people will come by just to see it, come by to taste, drink some of the juice, reminisce about the old days when they can remember when their parents or grandparents were cooking syrup. It's a time people get together and remember the past.
John Ashley from Brandon dropped by with some of his friends and remembers helping his granddaddy make syrup.
I remember a lot about it. I remember there were mules pulling the grinder, and I remember down the hill that there was a cooker, and my granddaddy was in charge of the juice, and my job was to keep the mules going and to keep the cane chews away.
Another modern refinement Leo has incorporated into his syrup making is a gas fire. Used to, the cooking would be fired with wood, and some people still use wood. But a gas fire is a lot easier to regulate. And syrup making is a temperamental process that takes finessing so it doesn't scorch. And the valve on a gas flame is a lot easier to manage than throwing on or taking off logs in a wood fire.
Notice the difference in the size of the bubbles?
And once the kettle is full and the fire is going full blast, there's little else to do but skim off the impurities as they float to the surface as it boils, and let the conversation thread its way from topic to topic for the next few hours.
No ketchup, no onions. I can get on that damn lane bicycle and start learning how to drive, and I run into every tree they wanted me over. I couldn't dodge a pine tree for nothing.
Has that ever happened to anybody here other than me?
No, you're the only one. It's gonna be thinner than what I cooked for Rita. Larry, I mean, really, that rabbit was at least 3 feet off the ground, not 4. Up in the corner of that tree.
The boiling juice goes through several stages as it cooks thicker and thicker. Each stage has its own look and its own smell.
It hadn't made that transitional smell yet, though.
No, it's still green.
Some syrup makers go by how the syrup sheets as it gets thick to determine when it's ready. But Leo Beatty's a little more scientific and a little more consistent with his syrup. He tested with a hydrometer.
34. Got 1 more to go. 2. And we ain't going 36.
You're not?
Not quite. It's right at the top of 35.
Mm-hmm.
Got to go to the bottom.
And then finally, the last reading. And Leo says,
It's syrup.
and after the declaration that it is syrup, the fire goes out, the dippers come out, and the boiled down contents of the syrup kettle gets one more straining as it goes into the container from which the jars are filled. And this cooking of 120 gallons of cane juice boiled down to 18.5 gallons of syrup. Over 100 gallons of liquid was turned to steam and boiled away during the day. And it's been a long day, from the time when the team started out this morning in the cane field until the final product is poured over some fresh biscuits. But at the end of the day comes the sweet reward, not only in a good yield of syrup, but in the sweet taste of satisfaction that comes only after a long day's work, of putting in the time it takes to make a good jar of Mississippi cane syrup.